National gun sales hit a major slump. Plus, Trump avoids gun policy in his first joint address to Congress. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show. To start us off this week, we wanted to talk about some of the big new gun sales numbers we've gotten for the month of February, the previous month, and they do not spell good news for the gun industry. A pretty substantial decrease in gun sales, and you wrote that up for us.
Yeah, big is probably the wrong word. Right?
Yeah,
we have new gun sales figures, but they're not big. They're the opposite. Yeah. They shrank by 9% year over year for February, and not the biggest decline in history, right? But you're talking about levels now that are below pre-pandemic levels. For gun sales, according to, right, we just to explain real quick how we get these numbers, how we understand this. The written piece has a more flushed out explanation, but we use the National Shooting Sports Foundation's adjusted numbers of NICS checks and National Instant Criminal Background Check System. That's the FBI background check system, and then NSSF will go in, look at the raw numbers the FBI puts out every month, and they will eliminate all the checks that are coded for anything that's not a gun sale, right? And we find that to be the most reliable form of tracking gun sales because, there's no national registry. In fact, it's illegal to have a national registry in the United States of firearms. So you can't, there's no way to track one-to-one what gun was sold, where, that sort of thing. And so you have to use other metrics, and background checks tend to be the best, most reliable way of tracking that, because all licensed dealers, all federally licensed dealers have to perform a NICS check on anyone who's purchasing a gun from them, as a customer, regardless of where that transaction happens, whether it's in store or online or at a gun show or something like that. So, and all new sales have to go through licensed dealers. So, you're getting a lot of these gun sales that happen on a regular basis. And a lot of states, 19 states now, require background checks on secondary market sales by private individuals. So basically, they have to go to a dealer if they want to sell a used gun to somebody in their state. So, or if you want to do it interstate. So a lot of these are captured, not all of them though, of course, because there's 24 states where you can use, for instance, something like a concealed carry license to bypass the background check, because in most states you have to pass a background check to get the license to begin with. So, and then a lot of states also, one reason not to use the raw numbers is that a lot of states will actually not just check new applicants for concealed carry licenses, but also they will recheck all of their old licensees every month. Like Illinois does that. And so there's several 100,000 rechecks run through NICS in Illinois. And if you just counted those all as gun sales, it would look like there's way more gun sales in Illinois than there actually are. So just a brief explainer on how we determine these numbers for gun sales, and why we think NSSF's analysis is the best one. The Trace does something similar. The FBI codes you can look at the report individually, and they'll code what checks are for what, what they're using the checks for, and they'll even break it down to like handguns and long guns. But and there's a little bit of guessing involved. How many permit checks are really sales checks, that sort of things. But NSSF, I think, is one of the most reliable statistics for this. And yeah, they found a 9% decline, which put February at the low. This is the second lowest February of the last 13 years. the only one lower was 2018, which may give you sort of an indication of where we're going with what this might tell us, right? Because Donald Trump was also president in 2018, which was a pre-pandemic year that saw very few gun sales comparatively to the years that have preceded it and to the years that followed it, right? The pandemic era was, especially 2020 through 2022, very high level of gun sales, but they've been declining ever since then. And now, they may decline even further, right?
Right. Yeah. You wrote a good members piece for us about this, kind of detailing what you think these numbers signal. And like you mentioned, the benchmark year 2018 that you compare this slump to was during the so-called Trump slump when Trump was in office. But I think some things you talked about in your members piece and some things we were discussing before we recorded today is that there's potential that something deeper is going on. It's not just the Trump slump. And can you tell us a little bit about why you think that?
Yeah. So the Trump slump, a lot of people attribute that to the disappearance of demand based on the idea that there may be new gun restrictions coming, right? And I think that is at play to some degree here as well. I think that's going to be an effect that you'll see in gun sales numbers during the second Trump administration. But that is largely what people assumed happened the first time around, where some gun buying, at least, is the result of people concerned that they won't be able to buy those firearms in the future because of new legislation, right? This is, you've seen this happen a number of times in the past, certainly around the Sandy Hook shooting, when there was a proposal for federal legislation in response to that. People were concerned that the AR-15 would be banned again under federal law. And so they rushed out and bought a lot of AR-15s during that spike. And then again, 2016, and the race between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, there was a lot of concern that, and you saw that kind of concern lead to higher gun sales during the whole Obama era, I would say. It kind of intensified around the Sandy Hook shooting because of what people thought might be the aftermath of that in terms of new gun restrictions. But it was something that remained elevated as Barack Obama pushed for more restrictions on firearms, mostly unsuccessfully during his term. But it was something that kept people going back to the store, or at least one thing that kept them going back. And you saw a similar spike in 2016 around that election, where a lot more people assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win that election, right? She won the popular vote, but lost the electoral college vote, and Trump became president. And it was really not something most people expected to happen at the time. And I think even the industry then was pretty caught off guard. That's how things went. And they had built up a lot of capacity and turned out a lot of guns around the idea that, there would be a spike in demand once Hillary Clinton became president and started pushing for stricter gun laws. And you did see a big spike during the 2016 election, but then, the first Trump slump happened where you had a decline in demand after that. And that was a particular problem for the gun industry for a number of companies, which, went out of business at the time, because they had anticipated a lot more demand than what ended up materializing. And so I think you're likely to see a continued decline in sales because of Trump being president and being perceived as a very pro-gun president who's unlikely to institute new gun restrictions. I think that's a bit overvalued. There is a real possibility that, especially in the aftermath of a mass shooting, we've seen Trump waver and actually advocate for new gun restrictions and even unilaterally enact them through the bump stock ban, for instance, in the wake of major mass shootings. So people probably are a little bit undervaluing that possibility. But regardless, the general consensus is that he's a fairly pro-gun politician, that he's likely to loosen gun laws rather than tighten them, which is probably generally the case outside of, like I mentioned, the risk associated with the aftermath of a major mass shooting. And so that leads to, the bringing down of this one concern that often motivates people to go and buy firearms. But we saw the first Trump slump was about a 17% decline year over year through the first 3 years of his presidency. And so this 9% decline in February, obviously that's not 17%. So there's certainly room for even further decline than that, just looking at the historical trend there. However, to get back to your initial point here, if you look at the period when Biden was president, right, that saw an even steeper decline. If you go from 2020 through 2024, what you'll find is there was like a 30% decline in year over year sales. And, that was with Joe Biden in office, providing, in theory at least, this motive for people to go and buy guns based on the political climate. And he even passed a gun control bill, one of the first gun control bills at the federal level in a generation, really. It wasn't an assault weapons ban, right? It didn't outright ban certain kinds of guns or anything like that, but it did add new people to the prohibited persons list for the first time in 30 years. No, it's a pretty small group of people, right? Somebody who's has domestic violence misdemeanor against a dating partner rather than someone they're related to or cohabiting with or married to. But you get the idea. He certainly made a lot of pushes for new gun restrictions through the executive branch as well, with the pistol brace ban and the ghost gun ban. And this didn't really stop this decline that I just talked about. Like, you still saw, now these were still elevated levels from the pre-pandemic period, from the Trump administration and even the Obama administration, but they were continually falling. And we've talked for years now about, like, where is this floor going to be? There were a number of false floors along the way, where you saw maybe a couple of months or a quarter where sales would be up over the previous year, but it never sustained, and it's kept falling. And now it appears it's going to continue to fall. And it does make you question whether even, political threats of new gun restrictions are enough to motivate people to go out and buy guns anymore, especially in the area where we had such a huge spike in sales in 2020, right? I mean, 2020 was kind of the perfect storm for gun sales. There were so many reasons that people might want to go out and buy a gun, even if they'd never bought one before, from all kinds of different political views or backgrounds, because you had the pandemic itself, which, especially in the early days, caused a lot of panic. Then you had the George Floyd's murder itself, and then you had the reaction to George Floyd's murder, which included rioting in a number of cities, right? And then you also had the election, where you had a stark contrast between Biden and Trump on gun policy, and Biden was the favorite to win that whole time. So all those things combined really pushed gun sales to such a high level that it's entirely possible that it's pulled demand forward for years, right? That we're still feeling that effect. And anyone who might be concerned enough by the potential of new legislation, new gun restrictions, to go out and buy a gun, they may have already done that in 2020, right? Because they were concerned about all these other things at the time. And they might have already bought their AR-15 or whatever other firearm that they might worry about being banned back 5 years ago, right? So that's another interesting effect to look at. And the industry in theory is better positioned this time around, perhaps, right? Trump was the favorite to win this election for most of the race. Though, when when Harris was swapped in to be the nominee, she did obviously get a boost for a while and led in the polling briefly, by margins that would make her, more competitive, certainly, than Joe Biden was. And she had a history of advocating for all kinds of gun bans and was still pushing for an assault weapons ban as part of her platform, even as she sort of tried to rhetorically find some common ground with gun owners by talking about her own gun ownership. She was still pushing for an assault weapons ban during that whole period. And she obviously had a background of advocating for even a handgun ban, a total handgun ban, when she was in San Francisco. But that didn't push sales higher, that choice. And it may be because most people still assumed Trump would win. And so the industry maybe was not as extended this time around, and maybe better able to weather any sort of downturn. So there is that. And the pandemic did produce millions of new gun owners. So in theory, the market, the base for the market in the gun industry is larger than it used to be. But that's where you start to wonder about these things, because the numbers aren't, if the base is so much larger now, why are we still seeing these declines to the point where we're below pre-pandemic levels of gun sales?
Right.
Right. I mean, that's what I would start to wonder about.
I would say that's where your saturation theory starts to make some sense to me. But of course, we'll have to, see future, sales data to know for sure how this all plays out.
Yeah, it's just 1 month. It's just the first full month of Trump's term. 9% decline is, it's significant. It's not insane. It's more about where that decline puts you. The February being one of the worst Februarys of the last 13 years. That's a bad sign, I think, because you do start to wonder, like, all these new gun owners that came in, maybe they're not getting those people back to the store for a second time the way they have with traditional gun owners. I don't know that, and maybe it's just a blip. It's just 1 month. We'll like you said, we'll keep watching it, but I don't know about you, but you start to wonder about these theories that, okay, the new gun owners will help sustain the industry. And this applies to more than just manufacturers or dealers too. So you can see it in the reloads numbers that people are not as interested in gun news as they were 2-3 years ago. We've seen that effect here. And I think it'll happen across gun, anything gun related. But I don't know, certainly the best gun sales year in history happened under Donald Trump. It's just that it happened because of all the things I mentioned earlier, all the chaotic events that occurred during 2020. And so, there's always a possibility we could get those things again, but I don't think it's something anyone would root for, just to see the industry do slightly better or even significantly better for a short period of time there. So, it's just something this is something that a lot of people expected to see, right? The Trump slump coming back. And we've held off on writing a bit about this because, I wanted to see what the numbers would be, wanted to see what the effect would be. Because, like I said, first of all, Biden didn't energize gun sales, not really. So it's not a given that Trump is going to have a major effect on them. But this first full month, the evidence points to maybe he will. Right.
But stay tuned to the Reload, and we'll keep you up to date on new developments as those new data points come in. But speaking of the Trump slump, a different kind of Trump slump, he gave his first full joint address to Congress, and the continued Trump slump in terms of references to gun policy at all continued apace, because the longest joint address to Congress in presidential history, where he listed all of his policy, his wins, what things he cares about, and guns once again did not make an appearance.
Yeah. So deja vu here, right? Because this is exactly what we saw at the RNC when he gave his longest in history acceptance speech. He didn't mention gun policy a single time then. And that's exactly what just happened here with this joint address to Congress. It wasn't it's technically not a State of the Union address.
Right.
I don't know that there's any real difference between, whatever a joint session and a State of the Union. But regardless, you spoke for like an hour and 40 minutes. Now, some of that was dragged out, I think, because, Al Green got up and was yelling at him and had to be escorted out. So maybe that inflates the numbers a little bit. But either way, even without that interruption, it still would have been a very, very long address, and just didn't talk about gun policy once, which I think speaks to this larger trend we've been talking about. It's not so much that Donald Trump is, going to push for new gun restrictions as a formal policy of his administration, or anything like that. In fact, I think we'd expect that he will implement a number of gun reforms that the gun rights movement and the gun industry will like in the end. I mean, that's one of the trade-offs that I talked about in my piece about lower gun sales is, certainly some gun dealers and gun rights advocates are okay with the lower sales in exchange for, greater protections for the industry, looser regulations, that sort of thing. And I think that's fair to expect to happen. It's just that, anytime the priorities are up against one another, any of Trump's priorities are up against gun rights, the other priorities are likely to take precedent, right? And we've already seen this a little bit with the export licensing freeze, which, by the way, this was in the gun sales piece, but they did lift that freeze. They actually lifted it apparently the day after we wrote our story on it. So I don't know if it had an impact there or not. One of the weird things about the whole export licensing freeze is that the Commerce Department just never said anything about it publicly. And really, a lot of the ways that even people in the industry heard about it was just word of mouth, one way or the other. They started they couldn't get their new licenses processed. And then mostly you're hearing like word of mouth as to why that was, because Commerce Department wouldn't say it, and they haven't said anything about it being lifted or why, or, really explained a lot of this stuff. And so, but both of our sources that had confirmed it the first time around, including Larry Keene from NSSF, confirmed that it was lifted. But it is an example where the Trump administration's priority of apparently trying to weed out exports to countries they don't like, that they don't want to go there, maybe they're trying to find loopholes, that priority was higher than, the gun industry's concerns about not being able to get export licenses. Or, this was a blanket freeze on all export licensing, but it certainly had an impact on gun exporters who had just come off their own previous freeze during the Biden administration. But it is, that freeze has been lifted now, but that situation is an example of what I mean by it's just not a top priority. They don't have it. They have a literal priorities list at the White House, right, on their website, and gun rights are not in that list. Trump did not mention them during his speech. He has already had situations where he has prioritized other interests over gun rights or the gun industry. And I think that's likely to continue, that this is just, it doesn't mean that there won't be pro-gun reforms, right? I'm trying to explain what I'm seeing here, right? And I think you agree with me on this view of the administration at this point. It's not that they won't make pro-gun reforms. In fact, they've obviously started the review process, although even that is kind of goes to the theme here, right? Instead of just doing things like they've been doing with all kinds of other issues, and in fact, doing things that are questionably constitutional that have been stopped by courts on a lot of things, right? Because their priority is that we want to take action and make these changes, and we'll see how it works out in the courts, has been their approach so far with a lot of this stuff, except gun policy, where they said, oh, we're going to have this 30-day review, and then we'll decide what we're going to take action on. So that doesn't mean they won't take action, right? It just shows that this is not something they're willing to go out and take the kind of flack they are with other issues in just acting and worrying about the consequences later, right? So we even have a story, I think, in the links that we'll kind of get to this point as well later on. But it's just what I'm seeing so far. Yeah, and I'm interested. Yeah, like, does that comport with what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, just Tuesday night is just another data point that we talked about this trend. He may do things for, moving things in a pro-gun direction, but it doesn't seem to want to tout it at all, and doesn't seem to want to. It's just very clear what he cares about and what he's willing to do, but maybe doesn't care enough about to emphasize or play up. And I just think the address was an indication of that.
And I think like a lot of it will come down to his underlings, right? Like he has, for instance, someone from the National Association for Gun Rights is one of his White House counsels. So, if that in areas where that appointee has influences, maybe you'll get more pro-gun stuff. But then obviously you have somebody like Pam Bondi as the Attorney General, who's had faced a lot of criticism from gun rights activists for her record of supporting things like red flag laws or age restrictions on gun ownership. And obviously the Attorney General is going to have a lot of say in where the administration goes. In fact, she is the one who's supposed to be reviewing these executive branch gun policies. And so, we'll see how that all shakes out, because it doesn't seem like Trump is going to be focused on any of this, or Musk either, right? Musk is sort of a co-president. I don't know what you would call him. Trump keeps saying he's in charge of Doge, and then in court they keep saying it's not. Musk is not in charge of it, but you can see where he's prioritized, and it's not gun related issues, despite the petition thing that he did during the campaign. So, with Musk and Trump not really focused on this at all, it doesn't mean there won't be things that gun rights activists like, or the gun industry likes. In fact, exports is another good example, because it's entirely possible that they'll repeal the Biden era restrictions on exports of certain guns to certain countries that preceded that previous freeze. In the end, they're probably, I would be surprised if they didn't get rid of that. But, along the way, if some other priority comes up and conflicts, they're going to go with the other priorities, is how it's shaking out so far. We're still early.
Yeah, absolutely. But pivoting away from Trump, the other big story this week, which we won't get too deep into because you'll have to stay tuned for the interview podcast to get a deeper dive into this. But of course, the Supreme Court on Tuesday heard oral arguments in the case involving Mexico suing Smith and Wesson and several of the gun industry's largest manufacturers, as well as one distributor, essentially trying to accuse them of participating, aiding and abetting criminal gun trafficking into Mexico, and trying to hold them financially responsible for the cartel violence down there. Justices heard oral arguments, and our basic top line takeaway is that it didn't seem to go particularly well for Mexico before the court. Yeah. And then, of course, you're going to talk to law professor Drew Stevenson to get into the details on this.
Yeah, and I think you'll have a members piece that dives deeper into exactly what each justice was saying during oral arguments, and why we think that Mexico is not going to fare well in this opinion that the Supreme Court hands down. It just seemed to me like it could be very lopsided. Honestly, this is still my takeaway from it. But, I wanted to have Drew Stevenson on because he has a different perspective than most of what I've seen out there. And he followed the case and the oral arguments very closely. He has a little bit of a different point of view, I think, on where this might come down. Although I think it's still overall, everyone seems to think Mexico is not going to win this, and win this, in this case doesn't mean even on the merits, just on the ability to continue the suit. That's what we're talking about here. Similar to the NRA case we had a while back at the Supreme Court, where the bar was very low. It's, the justices have to assume, they have to accept that the plaintiff's claims are correct or factual. because it's not an argument about the merits of the case. It's more an argument about the claims, the structural claims, and whether they can bypass the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which gives liability to gun businesses for the criminal acts of third parties, unless, they were involved in some way. And then that's why Mexico's claim was aiding and abetting. And, Smith and Wesson's main attack on that is just that Mexico's chain of causal chain was too long and too removed and too nonspecific to really work. And that seemed to gain a lot of credence with the justices, even some of the liberal justices. So, you'll have a piece on it, I think, for the members piece, diving into, more quotes from the oral arguments, more of the key quotes that give you some insight into what the justices may be thinking. And then we'll have that, of course. It's actually ended up being a pretty long, in-depth podcast with Professor Stevenson. So that'll be out for members, Reload members, on Sunday and Monday for everybody else. So make sure you look for that.
Yeah, absolutely. But getting into some stories from outside the Reload this week that we wanted to touch on, as you hinted at earlier, something that kind of indicates a conflict of policy preferences and which one's winning out. We had a report from the Washington Post about Trump's U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, Ed Martin, talking about how he plans to crack down on all gun crimes essentially committed in D.C., wants to prosecute them all with a emphasis, it seems, on felon in possession cases. So something where we've seen the gun rights movement litigate against the felon in possession ban pretty heavily. And it's been a hot topic that we've talked about, obviously, for many weeks. And then sort of a law and order preference where you got to stick it to so-called woke prosecutors or soft on crime policies. And we're going to prosecute. So this is another instance of that.
Yeah. So this is where we talked about this a little bit with Andrew Wellinger from Duke University. Again, just another example of potential conflicts of priorities, right? Is the priority here to prosecute every single gun crime that you could possibly find? Or is the priority to change the way that the Department of Justice approaches Second Amendment issues? Certainly seems that Ed Martin, I think he's the acting attorney general for DC, and he's been very, very controversial going after, this is sort of unrelated, but going after, Georgetown University for teaching DEI stuff he doesn't like, threatening to prosecute people over stuff they've said about Donald Trump. I think he threatened to prosecute Chuck Schumer. But regardless of all that, Ed Martin is basically saying he wants to prosecute every single gun crime possible. And that's where you might end up in conflict with gun rights priorities here. Because as you mentioned, one of the big things recently has been this push to eliminate the lifetime ban on firearm ownership for nonviolent felons, right? The Range case being the sort of marquee case for that. And so, obviously Martin here is kind of rhetorically, he's talking much more about criminals, violent criminals is the implication and is how he's talked about this. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But if you really are going to prosecute every single possible gun crime, especially felon in possession crimes, like most felon in possession crimes aren't actually violent crimes. They're literally just that you have a felony and you have a gun. And they don't have to prove anything beyond that. Right. So, even if your underlying felony was a violent crime, now, that's less controversial prosecuting those violent felons in possession of firearms than prosecuting nonviolent felons in possession of firearms. But, this is just another area where you may see that priority conflict come into play. Like Ed Martin certainly seems to be pushing for the tough on crime priority over the, gun rights, advancing gun rights through the Department of Justice policies. side of things. And we'll have to see too, like that was one of the things in the executive order was, having the Department of Justice try and reevaluate their positions on some of these questions. And so one of those big questions is felon in possession laws, and where should the department come down on that? Should it prosecute every felon in possession case, or should it just focus on the violent offenders involved? So it's just setting up another one of these potential showdowns. We'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's just another thing to keep an eye on to see how this administration approaches this stuff. And then the last one we're going to talk about.
Yeah. Also, real quick, of course, that it does also remind me of the January 6th pardons, right? Because they've expanded beyond just you've seen a number of cases now where they've expanded beyond the actual crimes associated with January 6th. And now DOJ is arguing that the pardon also applies to other unrelated crimes, including felon in possession crimes. So, I don't know. That's another area where getting these January 6th defendants out of the criminal justice system seems to be a higher priority than prosecuting felon in possession cases. So I don't know. We'll see if that also comes up again with this Ed Martin approach or not, but it's been another interesting area of conflict as we've seen.
No, that's a good point. Then the last story from outside the reload we want to talk about before we wrap up here is just another time to give some kudos to the New York Times, because I was pleasantly surprised to see a very interesting report on sort of this gun culture, gun business. They have a new reporter now that's on a firearms beat, and they're covering sort of the more niche, the less known, unless you're in this space, a lot of folks don't know about this side of the gun world and gun culture. And it's actually a good report, and it wasn't tut-tutting, and it wasn't, trying to say how weird this is. It was just a good, deep dive into a segment of, selling firearms accessories and
profiling people who work in the gun industry, not necessarily like the top players, the Smith and Wesson or Ruger or whatever, but just some smaller retailers and accessory dealers. And honestly, it even had a fairly good understanding of the industry and how, especially at the dealer level, how people actually make money, which is not through selling firearms, right? It's through selling mostly through accessories. That's where the actual profit margin is. Guns are very low profit margin business. And so, most gun stores aren't making their money by selling you a new Glock, because their profit margin on that is minuscule. They're making money by selling you new Glock magazines, or, a new sling or a new holster, or what have you, where the margins are a bit better, or, some sort of exotic. In this story, which was actually very interesting, they focus more on kind of drop culture, sort of collectible culture that goes on inside the gun industry, like a lot of other industries, like the shoe industry, for instance. And they focused on some of these higher end brands and their, low inventory strategy, and, the kinds of people who who are really, fueling these businesses, right? Like keeping them afloat, even in the business environment we talked about at the beginning of the show. The hobbyists, the builders, the collectors, the people who want to make clone guns of guns from movies or TV or video games or whatever, that sort of thing, which is more and more common anymore in the gun industry. They talked about how they looked at how these businesses work, where they came from, sort of how some of the people involved got their start. It's a really good piece, similar stuff to what we've done in the past, right? And even talking to some of the same people that we've talked to, right? The Better Way 2A is in there talking about their small business selling, patches that appeal to non-traditional gun owners, right? And then they talked to, was it Rooftop Defense was the name of the online dealer that they spoke with, that obviously is, working off of the Rooftop Korean motif from the LA riots. And that's a popular moment for a popular history for a lot of gun owners in America, that sort of idealizes what a lot of gun owners believe in as far as armed self-defense. And so, yeah, another solid piece. We'll have to have Neff on the show, the guy who writes these pieces, who's doing like the gun beat for the Times now. I've talked to him in the past, but I'd love to have him on the show just to get his perspective and what they're trying to do with this new approach to covering guns that you haven't seen at places like the Times before. So yeah, people should read the piece and see what it also, I think, gets at, like I was talking about earlier, this idea of saturation, right? Like everybody who wants an AR-15 probably has one at this point. Not, relatively speaking, like there's not a lot of capacity for lots of new people to run out and buy an AR-15 at any given moment right now, because a lot of people have already done that in the past. And the AR-15 doesn't expire, right? It doesn't go bad. There's the classic line about guns. They only have two enemies, right? Rust and politicians. And so if you keep a gun stored properly and maintained, oiled a little bit, it'll last 100, 150 years. There is a issue with the durability of the product that people in the gun industry sell, in that, like, you don't necessarily need to go out and buy one ever. Even a car, right, is not going to last you as long as a gun will. So, that's one of the other things with the industry is, like, you see a huge spike in sales like 2020. There's people who bought in 2020, even if they really like their purchase and they use their gun on a regular basis, they might not go back and buy a lot more guns because they already have one, right? You don't need more. Now, that's some people like myself, right, will become much more interested in firearms and want more, and then they become more like shoes, where you don't need more than one pair of shoes, but most people will have more than one pair of shoes because they're specialized to do lots of different things, or even just the fashion of it, the look of the gun, that kind of thing can appeal. So, but not everybody is like that. And I would say most people are probably not like that. So,
right.
Anyway, good piece, worth reading, I think. And hopefully we'll see more like that from the Times down the line.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It is interesting. There's definitely a new direction going on, at least with that individual reporter and that new beat that he seems to be on. So it's interesting stuff happening over there. It's
just one guy, but we're just two guys here at the Reload, and
right.
I think we have significant impact with what we do. We don't have anywhere near the resources of the New York Times, so I'm glad to see it. Just a serious focus on this type of reporting from a major publication like that. I'm sure it won't be perfect, but I think it's better than what we've seen before, for sure.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I'm headed up to the farm this weekend. Unfortunately, my grandfather is not in good health, so we want to go up and see him. Hopefully he'll be all right. But and we also have a bridal shower. My fiance has a bridal shower for my cousin's fiance. So I'll have to find something to do during that period. But how about you? You have anything going on this weekend? Any good plans?
Also, fiance plans. We're because I'm getting married later this year as well, and we're going to be working on planning out our honeymoon this weekend. So
nice. We haven't gotten to that yet. We're still we're still in the beginning phases of planning the wedding. Yeah. So I got the wedding website. I picked one among the 15 different ones that you can choose from. And now we got to finish setting all that up. We started doing our registry, which is, I guess, like, I did that I was like, let's just go to Target and we'll do some registry stuff just for like a fun thing, because you're just putting gifts on you. Here's stuff I want to buy. I want other people to buy me. Right. Yeah. So that takes out some of the stress. But yeah, there's still lots to do. And, I'm cheap too, so I don't want to spend that much on the wedding, but there's some things you can't, I don't want it to be a bad wedding either. Right. So, try to balance those two things together, but yeah. So, my wedding's not till the fall. So hopefully that's enough time to finish figuring everything out. I mean, I got my, swatches for the suits. It's an outdoor fall wedding, so they're green, and I think I'm going to go with tweed. I don't know. We'll see. But I don't know. Hopefully your planning will is further along than mine. But yeah, still looking forward to it. I think it'll be. I assume it'll be a very fun time, the wedding, and I hope yours goes well too.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that's all we've got for you guys this week. If you want to help support the reporting we do, as I mentioned, it's not a good environment right now. So if you want the Reload to stick around, make sure you sign up for a membership. That's how we are able to do this, is through our member dues. We are, I have us positioned so that we're not going to collapse tomorrow, but that is how we are able to do this, is through member dues. So please go ahead and check that out over at reload.com. And then also, we still have our ad swap going on with the Dispatch. So give a listen to why you might consider supporting them as well. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch. And so clearly I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news, and it's focused on it, and I think it's fantastic. But they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.